He did not rise to power through speeches, elections, or public admiration. He emerged quietly, moving through bureaucratic shadows, where decisions were made away from microphones and cameras. While the world focused on loud leaders and dramatic rallies, he built authority through fear, efficiency, and absolute control over information. Those who worked near him understood very quickly that this was not a man you argued with. He listened without emotion, responded without hesitation, and acted without mercy. In a system already built on brutality, he became someone even the brutal were cautious around. His presence alone was unsettling. Tall, imposing, and marked by visible scars, he looked less like a politician and more like a warning. He did not need to raise his voice. Silence was his weapon. Meetings often ended with no clear explanation, just a brief nod or a closed folder, and everyone knew what that meant. Orders would be carried out precisely as implied, because the consequences of misunderstanding were unthinkable. Careers ended overnight. People vanished from offices, from cities, sometimes from history itself. What made him especially dangerous was not rage or fanaticism, but control. He understood files, records, and intelligence the way others understood weapons. Information flowed toward him from every direction: surveillance reports, interrogations, intercepted communications. He knew who was loyal, who was weak, and who was simply pretending. This knowledge allowed him to manipulate both enemies and allies. Even those who outranked him on paper found themselves dependent on what he knew and what he chose to reveal. At the highest levels of power, fear is rarely obvious, but it was real. Senior figures avoided crossing him directly. They joked nervously about his methods in private, while publicly praising his efficiency. In reality, many understood that he represented something more extreme than ideology. He represented a system perfected to remove obstacles without accountability. If someone became inconvenient, the machinery he controlled would take over. There would be paperwork, signatures, and procedures, but the outcome was always the same. To outsiders, his role seemed administrative, even dull. Titles and departments masked the true extent of his influence. But behind those neutral words was authority over life and death on an industrial scale. Detention centers, secret prisons, and special units all traced their chains of command back to his office. He rarely visited these places himself. He did not need to. His name on a document was enough to ensure obedience. What disturbed observers most was his emotional distance. Witnesses later described him as calm, almost bored, while discussing matters that involved mass suffering. There was no visible pleasure, but also no hesitation. Human beings were reduced to numbers, risks, or problems to be solved. This detachment made him efficient, and efficiency made him invaluable to those above him. As long as results were delivered, questions were unnecessary. As the war intensified, his power expanded. Crises created opportunities, and he knew how to exploit them. Emergency measures became permanent. Temporary authority became absolute. Each new threat justified broader surveillance, harsher tactics, and fewer limits. In this environment, he thrived. He was not a visionary, but an enforcer, ensuring that the system ran without friction or dissent. Yet this same secrecy that protected him during his rise also planted the seeds of his eventual exposure. Very few understood the full scope of what he controlled, but rumors spread. Whispers moved through offices and foreign intelligence services. Analysts began to notice patterns: the same signatures, the same procedural language, the same outcomes. Slowly, a picture formed of a man operating at the center of a vast, hidden network. Still, for most of the world, he remained invisible. Newspapers printed other names. Radio broadcasts focused on speeches and battles. Meanwhile, decisions made in his office reshaped lives far beyond public view. By the time his name would finally emerge into the light, the damage was already done, and the question was no longer how much power he had held, but how long he had been allowed to wield it without challenge. As the conflict dragged on and pressure mounted from all sides, his authority did not weaken, it hardened. Where others reacted emotionally to setbacks, he adjusted procedures. Defeat on the battlefield meant stricter internal control. Bombing raids and advancing enemies only increased his influence, because chaos demanded order, and order was what he claimed to provide. The more unstable the situation became, the more essential he appeared to those at the top. His office evolved into a nerve center. Communications crossed his desk at all hours, and nothing significant moved without being filtered through his system. Arrests, interrogations, transfers, and executions followed a logic that only he fully understood. To those below him, the rules seemed to change constantly, but the outcome never did. Obedience was rewarded with survival. Hesitation was treated as disloyalty. Fear replaced ideology as the primary motivator. Foreign intelligence agencies began to notice his expanding footprint. Reports described a figure who rarely appeared in public but whose decisions echoed across occupied territories. Resistance movements felt his presence even when they did not know his name. Networks collapsed overnight. Safe houses were exposed with disturbing precision. It was clear that someone was coordinating repression with ruthless efficiency, learning from every mistake and adapting faster than his opponents. Inside the regime, tension grew. Rival departments competed for resources and influence, but few dared to challenge him directly. He possessed something more powerful than troops: records. Past conversations, signed orders, compromising details. He remembered everything. In a system built on loyalty tests and shifting alliances, memory was a weapon. Those who considered opposing him often reconsidered after quiet reminders of what he knew. Despite his reach, he remained personally distant. He delegated violence while retaining control over its direction. This separation allowed him to maintain the image of a manager rather than an executioner, even though the results were indistinguishable. Subordinates carried out the actions, but they acted within frameworks he designed. Responsibility dissolved into process, making it easier for everyone involved to claim they were simply following procedures. As defeats mounted, paranoia spread. The leadership demanded internal purges to root out imagined betrayal. He delivered them. Investigations multiplied. Accusations required little evidence. The system he oversaw turned inward, consuming its own members. Officers disappeared, officials were arrested, and long-serving loyalists found themselves suddenly accused of sabotage or treason. Each case reinforced the climate of fear and reminded everyone that no one was beyond suspicion. What made this phase especially destructive was its self-perpetuating nature. Every arrest justified the next. Confessions extracted under pressure confirmed pre-existing assumptions. Files grew thicker, and decisions became faster. Mercy was seen as weakness. In this environment, his methods were praised as necessary, even as they accelerated internal collapse. Control replaced strategy, and survival replaced purpose. Outside observers later struggled to understand how such a system functioned for as long as it did. The answer lay in his mastery of structure. He did not rely on charisma or belief. He relied on documentation, hierarchy, and routine. Violence became bureaucratic, scheduled, and normalized. This made it less visible and more difficult to resist. People feared the process more than the man, which was exactly how he intended it. By the final stages of the war, his world was shrinking. Territory was lost, communications failed, and resources vanished. Yet even then, he continued to issue orders as if control could be maintained through paperwork alone. The machinery he had built was too rigid to adapt to collapse. It continued to operate, arresting, interrogating, and executing, even as the larger structure disintegrated around it. Those closest to him noticed subtle changes. The certainty remained, but the margins narrowed. He demanded absolute compliance, not out of confidence, but necessity. The system could not afford doubt. In trying to preserve control until the very end, he revealed the true nature of his power: immense, efficient, and ultimately incapable of saving the regime it had served. When the collapse finally came, it arrived faster than the system he had built could process. Orders continued to be written, files continued to be stamped, but the authority behind them was gone. Cities fell. Communications broke down, and the rigid hierarchy that had sustained his power dissolved almost overnight. For a man who had relied entirely on structure and control, the sudden absence of both was catastrophic. There was no procedure for defeat, no document that could reverse what was happening. He attempted to disappear into the confusion, shedding titles and uniforms as if they were skins. The same secrecy that had protected him for years now became his shield. He moved cautiously, aware that his name, once spoken only in guarded offices, was beginning to circulate among those seeking accountability. The world that had ignored him was finally paying attention, and that attention was dangerous. Capture did not come through dramatic confrontation, but through persistence. Investigators followed fragments of paperwork, testimony from survivors, and the trails left by an over-documented system. The very bureaucracy he had perfected turned against him. Each signature, each authorization, each procedural note became evidence. The process that once erased people now preserved his actions in detail. During his arrest, observers noted the same composure that had defined his career. There was no outburst, no denial of the system he had served. He did not claim ignorance. Instead, he framed his actions as duty, legality, and necessity. This defense revealed the core of his worldview: morality replaced by function, responsibility dissolved into obedience. He had never seen himself as a monster, only as an administrator doing his job well. The trial forced his name into the public record. For the first time, audiences around the world heard about the mechanisms of repression not as rumors, but as documented fact. Witnesses described vanished families, destroyed networks, and lives reduced to case numbers. The calm language of official reports clashed violently with the human cost they represented. Each testimony stripped away the abstraction he had relied on. What shocked many was not just the scale of destruction, but how ordinary it sounded when explained through procedure. There were no dramatic speeches, only chains of command. No emotional justifications, only references to regulations and security. This ordinariness made the reality more disturbing. It suggested that extreme cruelty did not require madness, only organization and compliance. Throughout the proceedings, he remained consistent. He acknowledged his position and authority, but rejected personal guilt. Responsibility, he argued, was collective, spread across institutions and leaders. In doing so, he exposed a truth that unsettled even his judges: systems enable individuals to commit acts they might never commit alone. His defense was not a justification, but it was a warning. The verdict ended his personal power, but it did not end the questions his career raised. How many decisions had been made by people who never saw the consequences? How easily had professional ambition and loyalty replaced conscience? His case became a reference point, studied not for its uniqueness, but for its terrifying normality. He was not an anomaly. He was a product. In the years that followed, historians debated his legacy. Some focused on his efficiency, others on his brutality. But the most important lesson lay in the connection between bureaucracy and violence. His life demonstrated how systems designed for control can become engines of destruction when unchecked. Authority, when detached from accountability, does not need hatred to be lethal. Today, his story resonates beyond its historical moment. In an age of surveillance, data, and administrative power, the mechanisms he used feel uncomfortably familiar. His rise, actions, and fall serve as a reminder that the greatest threats often operate quietly, behind desks and documents, rather than on battlefields. His end closed a chapter, but the warning remains: when obedience replaces judgment, and efficiency replaces humanity, the conditions that allowed his power to exist can return.